As for Clinton, a newly released letter is heating up the controversy over his dealings with the draft. That story now from our national political correspondent, Gene Randall in Manchester. Gene?
Catherine, the letter was written by 23-year-old Rhodes Scholar Bill Clinton. He wrote it to the ROTC program head at the University of Arkansas. In it, Clinton explained why he pulled out of an agreement to enter the program, even though that was part of the deal to get him a student draft deferment continuance. Clinton also used the letter to describe his belief that the military draft was illegitimate. Word the letter would show up on Wednesday night's edition of Nightline on ABC prompted a Clinton effort to limit the potential for further damage to his presidential campaign. Part of the strategy, attacking the way the letter surfaced.
This morning, in a telephone conversation with me, Mr. Koppel confirmed to me that it is his understanding that ABC received the letter from two different sources, both of whom got it from the Pentagon. If this is true, the leak violates the Federal Privacy Act, and the fact that this leak apparently occurred just days before the New Hampshire primary can be no coincidence.
In the letter, Clinton, on his decision against going into the University of Arkansas's ROTC program, quote, "After I signed the ROTC letter of intent, I began to wonder whether the compromise I had made with myself was not more objectionable than the draft would have been, because I had no interest in the ROTC program in itself, and all I seemed to have done was to protect myself from physical harm." Clinton also wrote of what he called his anguish and loss of self-regard and self-confidence over his student deferment. But earlier in the three-page letter, Clinton condemned the draft system. Quote, "No government really rooted in limited parliamentary democracy should have the power to make its citizens fight and kill and die in a war they may oppose." He wrote, "One of my roommates is a draft resistor. He is one of the bravest, best men I know." On his own decision against becoming a resistor, quote, "I decided to accept the draft in spite of my beliefs for one reason, to maintain my political viability within the system." And Clinton termed his initial ROTC plan, quote, "the one way left in which I could possibly, but not positively, avoid both Vietnam and resistance." Bill Clinton, Wednesday morning, said it was easy to misread what he had written nearly a quarter century ago.
I was bitterly opposed to the war. I wanted to follow the law. I wanted to do what I had to do. And what is clear here is that I gave up my deferment before I had any idea what the lottery number would be.
In fact, Clinton's high lottery number kept him out of the draft. Clinton said his campaign would run the letter in a Manchester Union Leader newspaper ad on Thursday, and that he would trust the voters of New Hampshire to end what he called the road of dirty tricks. The Pentagon, meanwhile, says it's investigating the release of the letter, and the White House denies any involvement. Catherine?
Gene, assess for us how much this controversy has really sidetracked Clinton's campaign in the last several days.
Well, Catherine, Clinton said today he would fight like hell to get his campaign back on the real issues. But at this point, this is the real issue, getting this controversy behind him. So certainly he is sidetracked by this.
Gene Randall in Manchester.
In command when Clinton entered, then left the University of Arkansas ROTC. Jones, a Democrat, says he took the letter from the files only because he was still angry at Clinton for breaking his promise to join the ROTC.
All I'm saying is that he signed a contract and did not honor it.
In the letter, Clinton concedes that he may have deceived the ROTC, not by lying, but by failing to say that he was a deeply committed anti-war activist. Barbara Howsam, an ROTC secretary back then, remembers his letter as an absolute bombshell and a breach of trust.
The person that we issued a draft deferment to was not a war protester. The person that we issued a draft deferment to was someone who was a scholar, someone who was a Rhodes Scholar.
Thank you.
Clinton is fighting these days for his political life, trying to recapture the momentum he once enjoyed by blaming his problems on tabloids and Republicans with a new telephone number for those with questions about him or his campaign. Someone from Arkansas will return the call, and with paid half-hour television broadcasts tomorrow and Friday night. All across the country, state Democratic leaders are saying that the questions about Clinton's attitude toward the Vietnam War are hurting him significantly, especially among older Democrats, those with links to World War II and Korea, and among Vietnam veterans and their families. These are tough times for the governor. Jim Wooten, ABC News, Manchester, New Hampshire.
And it is surely another reminder of how America's turmoil in Vietnam clings to the national psyche. Governor Clinton was not alone in his opposition to the war then. nor in his agonizing before exposing himself to the draft. As ABC's Jeff Greenfield reports tonight, revisiting the Vietnam era
of a conflicted and thoughtful young man who, like so many Americans at the time, sought a deferment from the draft, and who, like many others, made himself available for the draft.
The 3-page, single-spaced letter was written when Clinton was 23, a graduate student in England. Obviously tortured over the issue, Clinton thanks the colonel for saving me from the draft. Acknowledging political ambitions, he wrote, I decided to accept the draft in spite of my beliefs for one reason, to maintain my political viability within the system. Clinton claimed Ted Koppel of ABC News told him the letter was leaked to ABC by the Pentagon.
We've been down the road of dirty tricks before.
Koppel told NBC News Clinton is mistaken, that he had only said it was my impression that the source got it from someone in the Pentagon, implying it was not an official leak. In any case, Clinton's aides were furious about this latest distraction.
Wait a minute. What do we got here? What is the Pentagon doing in the middle of a political campaign?
A Clinton supporter on Capitol Hill is asking the FBI to investigate the leak.
It is flat wrong, and it must be stopped.
Clinton continues to slide in the polls, just as the write-in movement for Mario Cuomo is picking up. Pollsters see damage beyond New Hampshire.
Well, I think Bill Clinton has to start worrying not just about the effect of this in New Hampshire, but looking beyond New Hampshire to the south, where people still have a strong sense of military obligation.
There are 6 days to go, and a lot can still happen, but leading Democrats are becoming increasingly concerned about the prospects for Clinton's candidacy. Tom?
Thank you, Andrea. And when Nightly News continues in a moment, for a long time, it never rained.
This issue lies here. For 40 years, America has had an unbroken succession of presidents who served in World War II. George Bush will almost certainly be the last of that era, where young men of privilege fought to get into combat, not out of it. This year, all 5 of the Democratic candidates were young men during a divisive, unpopular war, when millions served and millions more did everything they could to avoid service, out of self-interest or out of principle. As these men, like Bill Clinton, look back on their decisions, what seemed like very clear choices to them then may look very different to voters now, a quarter century later. Jeff Greenfield, ABC News, New York.
Governor Clinton will be on Nightline later this evening.
I want you to read this letter. 23 years later, I'm still proud of what I said then, and I want the people of New Hampshire to read it as well. I want you to all understand something. This is not about me or my campaign. This is a much bigger issue, an issue about the future of the people of New Hampshire and the future of the people of this country. It's about our economic life, which is on the line in this election. I have been fighting for it, and for 6 more days, I will continue to fight like hell to put this campaign back on the real issue. This kind of activity, violating the law, leaking papers, is exactly what was wrong with this country 20 years ago. It represents a pattern of behavior by people desperate to stay in power and willing to impugn the motives, the patriotism, and the lives of anyone who stands in their way. We've been down the road of dirty tricks before. It has to stop somewhere, and I think it should end now in New Hampshire. We've heard a lot in this campaign about the character issue. Well, character is an important issue, and so is patriotism. But this is not about my patriotism. I supported the Persian Gulf War because I thought it was right and in our national interest, just as I opposed the Vietnam War because I thought it was wrong and not in our national interest, and I still think I was right. The real character issue and the real patriotism issue in this election is who has a vision for the country, a plan for the future, and the ability to get it done. I do. I think this shows, again, what I have been trying to say. The people whose character and patriotism are really an issue in this election are those who would divert the attention of the people, destroy the reputations of their opponents, and divide the country we love. Thank you very much.
We get more on this story now from our own Judy Woodruff, who's been covering the Clinton campaign in New Hampshire today. She joins us tonight from public station WENH in Durham, New Hampshire. Judy, aside from what we've reported, that this was a leak of a letter from the Pentagon, is there any other reason that Clinton released this letter today that you know of?
Well, what they say, Charlene, is that the letter was leaked, as you mentioned, to ABC. The specifics of that were that Ted Koppel of ABC called the Clinton campaign, then Governor Clinton spoke with Mr. Koppel himself, who then told the Clinton campaign that the letter had been leaked to them from the Pentagon in some way. This was the campaign's explanation. I think on closer inspection, it's clear that the campaign wanted this letter out. It's been a couple of days since they knew that ABC and other news organizations had the letter and it might come out. They wanted to get control of the agenda. They want the letter out there. And I think they're taking a big gamble that the public is going to look at this and come to the conclusion that Clinton is trying to be direct and honest about an issue that has dogged him and, frankly, is miring him down in this campaign at this point.
Well, it's been floating around for at least a week, this whole draft deferment matter, as we said, released in the Wall Street Journal initially. Did we learn anything new from it today?
I don't think so, Charlene. I've read the letter very carefully, and it is the letter of a young man, 23 years old at the time, truly conflicted about the war, feeling very much strongly against the war, but loving his country, as he said. I think you can read this letter two ways, and it depends on what you feel about what he said last week about the draft deferment. You either look upon this as a young man who joined an ROTC program and then had an attack of conscience and decided to go ahead and put his name into the draft lottery and go fight in a war he didn't believe in. The less charitable interpretation is that he got special dispensation to avoid the draft for a year while he was over in England in graduate school, then misled the head of the ROTC program at the University of Arkansas into thinking that he was going to come back to Arkansas, join ROTC, and so forth. But then later on, when he realized there was going to be a lottery, he backed out of ROTC. I don't think the letter comes down hard one way or another. It depends on the spin that a person already had on this story.
Okay, well, you've been covering this campaign now this week up there in New Hampshire. What do you think the voters are thinking about the issue, and how do you think this letter is going to affect how they feel?
Well, I've been up here a little over about a day and a half, so I can't claim to have made any scientific sampling, but we have talked to a number of people. We've asked them about all the Democratic candidates, and when they bring up Clinton, a few of them have said to us, we think he is under attack from the Republicans, we think he's beleaguered, we feel sorry for him, and we think he's got a good program and he would make us a good president. But a number of others, both men and women, say they are troubled, not only by the draft story, but by the earlier stories of marital infidelity. The reason the draft story is such a big story, I think, is because it has raised again the question of honesty, credibility. And this is what the Clinton people are finding in their polling. They are very worried about this. He has continued to slip in the polls, and this is their way of trying to turn that around.
Well, going on the offensive today, what was the mood of the campaign? The campaign manager did I not see him at the news conference?
You saw off to the side, off to Governor Clinton's left, as he was standing there making his remarks, a very nervous and worried and pacing campaign staff. They were walking back and forth the whole time. Afterwards, a number of us buttonholed various members of the staff, and James Carville, who has been with the campaign and is a strategist for them, was really very frustrated, you could tell, and really angry that this whole thing has come up again. The campaign wants to get, as he said, as the governor said, back to the issues. But the draft question, and because it recalls the marital infidelity story, these just keep coming back up. They're very frustrated. He lashed out at the press a couple of times. You know, every campaign manager is going to do that at one point or another, but it's clear that today was not a high point for their campaign.
Right. He also said he was going to publish this letter tomorrow in the newspaper in toto. Well, are they having to change their strategy a little bit now?
Well, it's all very interesting, Charlene, because a few days ago they were saying they wanted to get off of the draft story and the marital story, but now I was just told, I ran into Frank Greer here at the station just a moment ago, who's advising the campaign on media. He says they can't get the ad in the Manchester Union Leader until Friday. So this is clearly going to go on for a few more days. My hunch is that they are taking a gamble here and hoping that by attacking this issue of credibility and honesty head on, that's the only way they can deal with it. Otherwise, they see their campaign going down the tubes.
Right. I know you haven't been there that long, but do you get any sense from the political pundits who've been floating around there for quite a while now. How the other candidates are reacting to all of this? I mean, do they smell blood?
Well, yes, they do. And the symbol, I guess the best symbol of that has been Senator Bob Kerry's reaction when this whole story first came out last week. He said, well, I'm going to stay away from that. That's his problem. A lot of people were conflicted by the war. But then over the weekend, he came back and said, well, I think that story, I have some doubts about his story. He's now, you know, even retracing his steps on that, and we're not sure that Senator Kerry is going to stick to his quote unquote doubts about it. Right. But all of them feel that Clinton is vulnerable. It's clear when you talk to them that they think that they have a shot because Clinton has been hurt. Tsongas, we haven't even mentioned his name. Former Senator Tsongas is the one who I think has been been the greatest beneficiary. He has moved up in the polls as Clinton has moved down.
Right, and I know the Bush people just blew into town today, and Clinton did go on the offensive, saying that this was Republican dirty tricks, or implying that. What's been their reaction, or do you have any idea at this point?
They're staying away from the story, Charlene. This was the day President Bush announced that he was running for re-election. He made the announcement, as you said, in Washington, flew up here to Manchester, New Hampshire, made a speech before the state legislature. They don't want to step on their own story. They would like not to have to comment on it, I think. But I would imagine that reporters at the Pentagon will be asking that question tomorrow.
Well, Clinton suggested it. Thank you, Judy, very much for being with us.
In greater detail.
All of this is the controversy over Bill Clinton's draft record, and this 22-year-old letter obtained by Nightline, in which Clinton writes, "No government should have the power to make its citizens fight and kill and die in a war they oppose."
It's the letter of a young man who loved his country and had strong beliefs about what was right and wrong at that time.
Tonight, a conversation with Governor Bill Clinton.
This is ABC News Nightline. Reporting from Washington, Ed Koppel.
Before this broadcast is over tonight, I will have read to you the entire text of a 22-year-old letter which was written by a 23-year-old Bill Clinton. It is, as Governor Clinton himself described it today, the account of a conflicted and thoughtful young man. It is quite a remarkable letter, actually, eloquent and revealing. Many of you will hear it and find in it a reaffirmation of everything you like and admire about Bill Clinton. Others among you will be angered by what you hear. It is safe to assume that those who leaked the letter to us at Nightline and to our colleagues at World News Tonight did not do so in the expectation, however, that this letter would help the Clinton campaign. As the governor noted earlier in the day, presidential politics is a contact sport. Having said that, it is also clear that the Clinton campaign feels that the leaking of the letter just days before the New Hampshire primary is a low blow. A quick summary now from Nightline correspondent Jeff Greenfield.
George Bush and the Republican Party will do anything it takes to win. That's what they did in 1988. And they'll do it again in 1992.
Bill Clinton was talking about the leak of a letter he had written more than 22 years ago, filled with a young man's anguish and anger about the war in Vietnam and the draft. But as the governor of Arkansas faced this roomful of reporters today, he might have been asking himself, how did I get here?
Sure, shoot us. There you go.
For months, Clinton's presidential campaign had been a textbook model. He had been on a roll since last November, when a speech in Chicago had wowed the state party chairs and the political press with its broadly appealing message of public compassion and personal responsibility.
Most people are worried about keeping body and soul together, and they're asking, since I played by the rules, I paid the taxes, I did the work, I sent my kids to war, why am I getting the shaft? It is those questions that we have to answer if we want to win the election of 1992.
He'd won the money primary, far outstripping his rivals in raising campaign funds. He'd won the media primary, with magazine covers touting his progress. And earlier this year, the polls were showing the 45-year-old Clinton sprinting to a big lead in New Hampshire, where a big primary win would likely mean an all but inevitable presidential nomination.
It became clear well before the first of the year that Clinton had thought through what it meant to be president, had answers to all these significant questions about issues, had the kind of message that would likely make him electable if he won a nomination.
Even the widely publicized charges of marital infidelity 3 weeks ago did not derail his campaign. But when the Wall Street Journal last week charged that Clinton had received a Vietnam draft deferment for an ROTC program he never joined, the ground seemed to shift.
Members of the same political class that 2 months ago were saying, this guy's the winner, are now questioning his electability.
Clinton has long acknowledged his opposition to the Vietnam War. As a Rhodes Scholar in England, he helped organize an anti-war protest in November of 1969. But he has also said that it was his doubts about the morality of the war and the Selective Service system that led him to abandon the ROTC idea and to subject himself to a draft lottery. Only the luck of the draw, a high lottery number, kept him out. One of his friends from his Oxford days strongly backs Clinton's story.
The recollection of people who knew Bill Clinton well, who were with him every day, was that when he arrived back in Oxford in the fall of 1969, he expected that he would be drafted. He was so uncertain about his future and so uncertain about how much of the year he would be able to complete at Oxford that he did not rent a room for himself. He lived with friends instead.
But fairly or not, the issue has clearly hurt.
Certainly the fact that most people just met Bill Clinton recently makes it more difficult to deal with this. They don't know about his career. They don't know about a lifetime of dealing with interesting issues. They don't know about the kinds of things he's been talking about for a dozen years in government.
Now, Clinton is taking to the airwaves, urging New Hampshire voters to send a message about the process.
Now there are those who want to divide and distract us from what's really important. But I trust the people of New Hampshire to reject that kind of negative politics.
Even before the first primary votes have been cast, Bill Clinton has already been through 2 acts of any presidential campaign, the gee whiz stage and the wait a minute stage. The outcome of the 3rd act will almost certainly determine his political fate. I'm Jeff Greenfield for Nightline.
And joining us now live from Manchester, New Hampshire, is Governor Bill Clinton. Good evening, Governor.
Good evening, Ted.
As I told you just before we went on the air, we have a late tracking poll from the Boston Globe and television station WBZ. We're going to take a look at that tracking poll right now. If you'll look at your screen, you will see that a few days ago, do you have a screen there where you can see it?
Yeah.
Okay. A few days ago, on the 8th of February, you were still showing 28%, and Senator Tsongas was showing 25%. As of today, Tsongas is up to 30%. You're down to 19%. Do you attribute that? Do you attribute the impact to the Wall Street Journal story, which first raised the draft issue?
Well, I think that, and then the comments over the weekend when I was not in New Hampshire. I was home trying to get over the flu, and there were a lot of press reports over the weekend saying, well, this raises questions about his electability and questions about character, and I think a lot of people heard from it secondhand. I should have put an ad on right away as soon as the Journal story broke. The Journal story itself confirmed what I said all along, which is that I gave up my deferment before the lottery came in. I was in the draft. It was the luck of the draw that I got a high lottery number. I did not dodge the draft. I did not do anything wrong. And that has not been contradicted, even by people who've changed their stories over the intervening years.
Governor, if I may, I'd like to come back to that after folks have had a chance to hear the entire letter.
Sure.
I have to assume that when you were not out campaigning and pressing the flesh today, that you and your advisors had to be sitting around saying, how do we turn this thing around again? How do we take a campaign that clearly has been dealt a body blow and put it back on track again?
Well, I thought, frankly, that we bottomed out a couple of days ago, and sometimes these polls drag a little bit from when you hit rock bottom. Frankly, I've been amazed at the number of my supporters in New Hampshire and the number of people who stayed with us. I mean, after all, they just met me a few months ago. They don't know much about me. It's not like they've worked through 11 years of hard issues and all the things I've done as governor. They've not seen the real evidence of my political leadership and character. And so I think they've had all this stuff dumped on them here in the last 2 or 3 weeks, and finally the dam broke and they're asking themselves questions. The encouraging thing to me, looking into the eyes of the voters with whom I'm shaking hands, and going to these meetings where we're still drawing very, very large crowds, is that I think people are going to take another look. The people of this state are fundamentally fair. They're hurting. They desperately want this election to be about their tomorrows, their future, their problems, not about my yesterdays. They just want to know that I'm all right, that I can do this job, that I can make them a good president. And I hope I can tell them that that's the way it is in the next few days. I feel good about what happened today. I feel good about yesterday. and I'm going to fight like crazy from here on in.
All right, Governor, we're going to take a break. When we come back, we'll hear the entire letter that Bill Clinton wrote more than 22 years ago.
This is ABC News Nightline, brought to you by Carnival Cruise Lines.
This again live from our affiliate WMUR in Manchester, New Hampshire. On December 3rd, 1969, Bill Clinton, then in the second year of a Rhodes Scholarship at Oxford University in England, wrote a letter to Colonel Eugene Holmes, who headed up the Reserve Officer Training Corps program at the University of Arkansas. What follows is the full text of that letter. I asked Governor Clinton if he would like to read the letter. He said he would prefer that I do it. Dear Colonel Holmes, I'm sorry to be so long in writing. I know I promised to let you hear from me at least once a month, and from now on you will, but I've had to have some time to think about this first letter. Almost daily since my return to England, I've thought about writing about what I want to and ought to say. First, I want to thank you, not just for saving me from the draft, but for being so kind and decent to me last summer when I was as low as I've ever been. One thing which made the bond we struck in good faith somewhat palatable to me was my high regard for you personally. In retrospect, it seems that the admiration might not have been mutual had you known a little more about me, about my political beliefs and activities. At least you might have thought me more fit for the draft than for ROTC. Let me try to explain. As you know, I worked for 2 years in a very minor position on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. I did it for the experience and the salary, but also for the opportunity, however small, of working every day against a war I opposed and despised with a depth of feeling I had reserved solely for racism in America before Vietnam. I did not take the matter lightly, but studied it carefully, and there was a time when not many people had more information about Vietnam at hand than I did. I have written and spoken and marched against the war. One of the national organizers of the Vietnam Moratorium is a close friend of mine. After I left Arkansas last summer, I went to Washington to work in the national headquarters of the moratorium, then to England to organize the Americans here for demonstrations here October 15th and November 16th. Interlocked with the war in the draft issue, which I did not begin to consider separately until early 1968, for a law seminar, I wrote a paper on the legal arguments for and against allowing, within the Selective Service System, the classification of selective conscientious objection for those opposed to participation in a particular war, not simply to, quote, participation in war in any form, end quote. From my work, I came to believe that the draft system itself is illegitimate. No government really rooted in limited parliamentary democracy should have the power to make its citizens fight and kill and die in a war they may oppose, a war which even possibly may be wrong, a war which, in any case, does not involve immediately the peace and freedom of the nation. The draft was justified in World War II because the life of the people collectively was at stake. Individuals had to fight if their nation was to survive for the lives of their countrymen and their way of life. Vietnam is no such case. Nor was Korea an example where, in my opinion, certain military action was justified, but the draft was not, for the reasons stated above. Because of my opposition to the draft and the war, I am in great sympathy with those who are not willing to fight, kill, and maybe die for their country. That is, the particular policy of a particular government, right or wrong. Two of my friends at Oxford are conscientious objectors. I wrote a letter of recommendation for one of them to his Mississippi Draft Board, a letter which I am more proud of than anything else I wrote at Oxford last year. One of my roommates is a draft resistor who is possibly under indictment and may never be able to go home again. He is one of the bravest, best men I know. His country needs men like him more than they know. That he is considered a criminal is an obscenity. The decision not to be a resistor and the related subsequent decisions were the most difficult of my life. I decided to accept the draft in spite of my beliefs for one reason: to maintain my political viability within the system. For years, I have worked to prepare myself for a political life characterized by both practical political ability and concern for rapid social progress. It is a life I still feel compelled to try to lead. I do not think our system of government is by definition corrupt, however dangerous and inadequate it has been in recent years. The society may be corrupt, but that is not the same thing, and if that is true, we are all finished anyway. When the draft came, despite political convictions, I was having a hard time facing the prospect of fighting a war I had been fighting against, and that is why I contacted you. ROTC was the one way left in which I could possibly, but not positively, avoid both Vietnam and resistance. Going on with my education, even coming back to England, played no part in my decision to join ROTC. I am back here and would have been at Arkansas Law School because there is nothing else I can do. In fact, I would like to have been able to take a year out, perhaps to teach in a small college or work on some community action project, and in the process to decide whether to attend law school or graduate school and how to be putting what I have learned to use. But the particulars of my personal life are not nearly as important to me as the principles involved. After I signed the ROTC letter of intent, I began to wonder whether the compromise I had made with myself was not more objectionable than the draft would have been, because I had no interest in the ROTC program in itself, and all I seemed to have done was to protect myself from physical harm. Also, I began to think I had deceived you, not by lies, there were none, but by failing to tell you all the things I'm writing now. I doubt that I had the mental coherence to articulate them. At that time, after we had made our agreement and you had sent my 1A deferment to my draft board, actually that's my 1D deferment to my draft board, the anguish and loss of self-respect and self-confidence really set in. I hardly slept for weeks and kept going by eating compulsively and reading until exhaustion brought sleep. Finally, on September 12th, I stayed up all night writing a letter to the chairman of my draft board saying basically what is in the preceding paragraph, thanking him for trying to help me in a case where he really couldn't, and stating that I couldn't do the ROTC after all, and would he please draft me as soon as possible. I never mailed the letter, but I did carry it on me every day until I got on the plane to return to England. I didn't mail the letter because I didn't see in the end how my going in the Army and maybe going to Vietnam would achieve anything except a feeling that I had punished myself and gotten what I deserved. So I came back to England to try to make something of the second year of my Rhodes Scholarship. And that is where I am now, writing to you because you've been good to me and have a right to know what I think and feel. I am writing, too, in the hope that my telling this one story will help you to understand more clearly how so many fine people have come to find themselves still loving their country, but loathing the military, to which you and other good men have devoted years, lifetimes, of the best service you could give. To many of us, it is no longer clear what is service and what is disservice, or if it is clear, the conclusion is likely to be illegal. Forgive the length of this letter. There was much to say. There is still a lot to be said, but it can wait. Please say hello to Colonel Jones for me. Merry Christmas. Sincerely, Bill Clinton. That is the end of the letter. We're going to have to take a break. When we come back, we will talk again live with Governor Clinton.
George Bush and the Republican Party will do anything it takes to win. That's what they did in 1988, and they'll do it again in 1992.
I promised you this morning that I would tell our audience tonight what I told you when you and I spoke on the phone this morning at 9, namely that while I could not reveal the source who gave us the copy of your letter, that it was my impression this morning that our source had gotten it from someone at the Pentagon. I must also tell you that I got a call from that source after your press conference this morning in New Hampshire, in which that person told me that indeed it had not come from the Pentagon. He put us on to a couple of other clues that we followed up during the course of the day. And just to bring our audience fully up to date, you know I called you late this afternoon to bring you up to speed on that. Given that information and the fact that World News Tonight got its information from Colonel Jones, who was an aide to the head of the ROTC at the University of Arkansas, do you still feel that the Bush administration bears any burden of responsibility for the release of this letter?
I have no idea. I don't know what your source was or where it came from, so I can't comment on that. I think the important thing is that the letter is consistent with everything I've been saying for the last 13 years since I was first asked about this in late 1978. I was in the draft before the lottery came in. I gave up the deferment. I got a high lottery number, and I wasn't called. That's what the records reflect. A Republican member of my draft board has given an affidavit in the last couple of days saying that I got no special treatment, and nothing in that letter changes that, although It is a true reflection of the deep and conflicted feelings of a just turned 23-year-old young man. I felt that at the time.
And indeed, if we were electing that 23-year-old man, what he said and thought and felt at that time would be germane. What is germane now, however, is what the 45 or 46-year-old Bill Clinton thinks. And when you wrote, for example, that at the time you felt perhaps that young men ought to have a chance to selectively decide whether they wanted to be conscientious objectors in a particular war. The way things are right now, I should explain to our audience, is you're either a conscientious objector across the board. You can't pick and choose. You can't say, I like this war, don't like that war. Where does Bill Clinton stand on that issue today?
I have somewhat different feelings about that now. I think we ought to have a draft only when there is clear and present need, when we're going to have a lot of people in harm's way, when the volunteer army is insufficient to the task, and when there ought to be broad-based service. I do think when you have a general draft, at least there ought to be a declaration of war so that Congress can say the broad national interests are at issue. Or at least something like Senator Nunn's War Powers Act ought to be enacted. The problem we had in Vietnam was that we were ambivalent. We actually wound up weakening our military and undermining our military posture in the world for years after that. Because the country didn't support it, the people were divided, and the truth was we never really intended to, nor were we able to win the war in any conventional sense.
We had last year, obviously, a volunteer army in Operation Desert Storm. You were one of the few leading Democrats in the country who supported that operation. Let's say Bill Clinton had been president at the time, and let us just say, hypothetically, that there had been a draft in place, and that several thousands or tens of thousands of young men had taken the view that young Bill Clinton took back in 1969. What would President Clinton have done about that?
Well, I would have asked the Congress for an explicit expression of support through the United Nations. And I think that I would have asked, if we'd had the draft, I would have asked them to actually declare war. I think once the Congress declares war under the Constitution, then you can have a broad conscription. I think, as I said, I think it was warranted in World War II. I think, as I said, I supported the conflict in Korea. Our country has shown over and over again that large numbers of our people will voluntarily serve in the armed forces when there is broad-based support for a policy, when they understand it.
But Governor,
that was clearly the case in Desert Storm.
Before we have to take a break, and we will in a little bit less than a minute, my question was what President Clinton would have done or would have recommended to his Justice Department be done with, let's say, a few thousand young men who took the position that you took 20-some-odd years ago, namely, we don't like this war. We don't think blood should be shed for oil. Even if there had been a declaration of war, what do you do with young men like that who are acting on their conscience?
Well, first of all, in a democracy, I favor the kind of volunteer force that we have now. If we had had a draft, then I would have gone to the Congress and asked for an explicit declaration of war. Then I would not have approved a selective conscientious objection. The problem with Vietnam all along was the ambivalence that ripped through our country, that ripped through our policy, and the fact that it was simply wrong-headed. It weakened the military. It weakened our position in the world. But in order to have, I have different views now than I did then about the appropriateness of that selective conscientious objector doctrine. But at least I think if you're going to have a draft and not allow conscientious objection on a particular basis, the United States Congress, which has the constitutional authority to declare war, ought to have to do it.
Governor Clinton, we're going to have to take a break. When we come back, and again, I should tell our audience, this is something I discussed with the governor this morning. We'll do a few more minutes on this subject and then also talk about other issues. We'll continue our discussion in a moment.
You hear all the static one way or the other. What only matters when you strip it all away is who can lead this country to greatness.
Governor Clinton, back to the letter again and the timing. You wrote this letter on December 3rd of 1969. December 1st of 1969 is when your number came up in the lottery. You initially told reporters that you weren't aware of the fact that you had a high number in the lottery. Then later on you told my colleague Jim Wooten that you probably did know. Which was it? Have you refreshed your memory on it?
I honestly don't remember. But I think that in this day and age of instantaneous communications, most people would find it difficult to believe that I did not know. I don't know whether I knew or not. If you assume I did or I didn't, it doesn't really change the letter since I had lost my draft deferment several weeks before. I just don't know.
The reason I ask, Governor, is because the next day, on the 2nd of December, is when you sent off your application to the Yale Law School. And then the day after that, the 3rd of December, is when you sent this letter to Colonel Holmes. And there does seem to be a sense about those two actions of someone who knew, or at least was fairly confident at that point, that he was not going to be drafted.
Well, I don't think that's right. I can remember even up in the spring, late as March of the next year, being told that I might not be able to do anything else, that I might be called in that year. We didn't know for some time that we would not be called for sure.
You mean even after you knew your number was 311, which put you in the bottom third?
That's right. I remember distinctly being told. At some point after that, we checked at home, and I was told that they couldn't say with any certainty that I could do anything other than spend another term at Oxford, that I'd probably be able to stay through May, but that's all I knew. At that time, it wasn't uncommon for people to apply to graduate schools knowing that they might or might not be able to go. They might get in and then have it deferred while they were in the military service.
Well, although deferment for graduate school at that point was no longer a possibility, that had
No,
been
not deferment. I don't mean defer entering law school.
I understand.
Yes, you couldn't get a deferment. You would delay entering school while you did your service. But when I sent off the application, that's because I had been out of the ROTC program for several weeks. It wasn't an option for me anymore. I was in the draft, and so I was either going to be called or go to law school, but I didn't know for sure then.
But what you're saying is that December 1, you get your high lottery number. December 2, the letter goes off to Yale Law School. December 3, you write your letter to Colonel Holmes. That's just coincidence of timing. I mean, there's nothing that we should
I
read
just don't
into
remember. There's nothing to read into it. The important thing for the American people to know is that in late September, early October, sometime about that time, I think it was in September, I talked to my stepfather, asked him to talk to the draft board and to Colonel Holmes, asked that I be put back into the draft. I was put back into the draft before the lottery came along, before I knew my lottery number. And I was in the draft. If I'd drawn number 1 or number 10, none of this would have happened, and we wouldn't be having this conversation today.
So Colonel Holmes then knew some weeks before you wrote this letter that you were, in fact, back in the draft again.
As he said that in the Wall Street Journal article. Even in the Wall Street Journal article, he pointed out, even though with a totally different twist than he put on it for 13 years, that they participated in revoking my deferment in the fall.
See, the reason I asked that, Governor, is because the last paragraph of your letter, and forgive me for being repetitive here, you say, I am writing to in the hope that by telling this one story, no, wait a second.
That's right.
Yeah, no. I wanted to get a slightly different. I didn't mail the letter, you're saying. That is the letter to the chairman of the draft board, because I didn't see in the end how my going in the Army and maybe going to Vietnam would achieve anything except the feeling that I had punished myself and gotten what I deserved. So I came back to England to try to make something of the second year of my Rhodes Scholarship, and that is where I am now, writing to you because you've been good to me and so on. That doesn't sound like the voice of a young man who expects that he is likely to be drafted.
No, but look, you got to go back and look what happened in the intervening time. Unfortunately, 2 of the other principals are dead, my stepfather and the head of the draft board, the only people who had any other contact. All that happened by telephone. But if you look at the records and look at what the draft board says, they point out that my deferment was withdrawn in October. I was put back in the draft pool. Then the lottery came in. Then I got a high draft number. And let me say this, Ted. Back in 1978, when this was first raised, I had not seen or heard from Colonel Holmes in 9 years. We'd had no contact. The minute someone asked me about it, I said, call Colonel Holmes. I didn't talk to any handlers. I didn't run around and think about anything. I just said, call him. He said, I don't remember all the facts of that case, but if anything wrong had happened, I'd know. In 1991, he said the same thing. There was never any negative connotation coming out of that ROTC program until the Wall Street Journal article. But even there, they all admit that I lost my deferment before the lottery came in. So the bottom line is, I wasn't a draft dodger. That guy had been good to me. I thought, since I didn't write it to the head of the draft board, and since he had been good to me, I ought to lay out how I felt about all this, and why, in the end, I didn't think it was right to have a 4-year deferment, and I ought to go back into the draft. I was trying to make that case to him. And if you read the whole letter in context, I think it makes that plain. But it's consistent with everything I have said in all these years.
All right, Governor Clinton, we're going to have to take another break. When we come back, I'd just like to ask you how you think this is going to play in your neck of the woods down south, where indeed support of the Army is a stronger issue than perhaps most other parts of the country. We'll continue our discussion in a moment.
One thing, in tough times with no help by good people who heard all this stuff, I mean, if you're looking for somebody that's already been tested, you ought to go with me.
Governor Clinton, this is not 1969, it's not 1978. You are now running, among other things, for the post of Commander-in-Chief of the United States. And while legally, technically, in every respect, everything you say may be quite accurate, you know this letter has a flavor which is not going to sit well with folks down south, in particular, folks from Arkansas, among other places. How do you explain it to them? Again, I'm not asking about details, I'm not asking about technicalities, just the flavor.
Well, let's look at it. First of all, it is the letter of a deeply agitated 23-year-old boy, a young man. At least I was involved in the issues of my time. I cared deeply about them. That's the way I felt. If I were writing that letter today about how I felt, I'd still disagree with our policy in Vietnam, but I wouldn't say the same things in the same way. Look, I was born right after the war. My father died before I was born, but he was in World War II. One of the most precious memories of my childhood is my mother trying to get me to know my dead father, showing me a presidential citation, some sort of citation he'd received for good duty in the war. I was proud of that. I wanted to be part of my country's defense and my country's service. Then I turned against the Vietnam War. I hated doing that. It was an anguishing thing for me. You can tell that from the letter. Then I became governor, commander of my National Guard. I called out the Guard to quell a riot at Fort Chaffee. I supported the National Guard and the veterans groups of my state strongly. I supported our involvement in the Persian Gulf War. I have no doubt about my capacity to be commander-in-chief. And the fact that I didn't serve after putting myself in the lottery should not be disabling. I mean, Dick Cheney, the Secretary of Defense, had deferments all the way through. I didn't have deferments all the way through. But I think he's been a pretty good Secretary of Defense. I'm proud of the job he's done. And I didn't think one time during that Gulf War that he was somehow incapacitated from being the leader of the Defense Department because he'd had deferments.
Governor, what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. When Dan Quayle, when the story about his National Guard service came out, it was in the media for weeks, probably for months, I think it's fair to say. You think you're going to be able to put this one behind you now?
And I'd just like to point out what I said about that at the time. I said Dan Quayle ought to just tell the truth, get the facts out, and let it go. You know, he was for the Vietnam War, but got into the National Guard. That wasn't an option for me. They were all full, all those slots. I was against the Vietnam War, but I gave up a deferment and put myself back into the draft. I got a high lottery number. If the people know the facts, I think they'll be all right. Let me say this. We've been talking about a letter I wrote 22 years ago as if it's a test of presidential character. 22 days ago, George Bush gave a State of the Union address, promised a tax cut for the middle class and capital gains for the wealthy. Today, 22 days later, he's up here in New Hampshire where people are hurting, where the food stamp and welfare and unemployment rolls have tripled. And he says, well, we're going to put off this middle class tax cut, but I want a bigger cut for the wealthy. I think that's a test of presidential character. If we're going to talk about 22 years ago, let's talk about my whole record as governor, my demonstrations of character, my fitness to lead, and compare it to that kind of issue, which I think is very important, too.
Governor, even at the risk of going a minute or two over our allotted time, I promised you'd be able to talk about other things. You have been able now to just make that turn. During these remaining 5 or 6 days before the voters in New Hampshire go to the polls, what are you going to try to focus on? What specifically do you think most captures their needs, their attention, and what is it you're going to try and focus their attention on now?
I'm going to tell them that this is an employment decision they're making. They are hiring the most important public official in the United States, and they are hurting as badly as any people in the United States. They ought to look for a person with a vision, with a plan, with a record, and with a capacity to change their lives for the better. I'm going to try to give this election back to the people, to lift the cloud off of this election. For 3 weeks, of course, I've had some problems in the polls. All I've been asked about by the press are a woman I didn't sleep with and a draft I didn't dodge. Now I'm going to try to give them this election back. And if I can give it back to them and fight for them and fight for their future, I think we've got a chance to do well here, and I know we can go beyond here and continue to take this fight to the American people.
Governor Clinton, I thank you for joining us tonight. It was good of you. I know it's been a long and hard day. Thanks very much, sir.
Thank you, Ted.
I'll be back in a moment with a program announcement about an extraordinary broadcast that we're going to be doing on Friday. News, good night.
Has taken its toll. Tracking numbers from CNN USA Today Gallup show the former front runner 15 points down against Paul Tsongas for next Tuesday's vote. Clinton complains he is on the ropes politically for conduct unconnected with his long public service. The issue intensified yesterday with the leaking of a letter written by the 23-year-old Clinton thanking an Army officer for saving him from the draft and apologizing for misleading him. Clinton denies any wrongdoing.
I'm going to try to give this election back to the people, to lift the cloud off of this election. For 3 weeks, of course, I've had some problems in the polls. All I've been asked about by the press are a woman I didn't sleep with and a draft I didn't dodge.
So it's up to the Democratic voters of New Hampshire to judge whether young Bill Clinton was draft dodging and whether that makes any difference in his qualifications to be president. Bob Beckel is sitting in for Mike Kinsley tonight. Bob?
Okay, David, Bill Clinton opposed the war in Vietnam. He sought an alternative in ROTC. He then lost some friends, very close friends in that war. He decided to change his mind and let himself get into the draft. This guy should be applauded tonight, not condemned. What's your beef?
I'm not sure that's right, Bob.
Well, no, I just gave you some facts. Now, what's the beef?
Well, I think we go back to start to question the facts, because the question is, did he in fact intend to go into the ROTC? His mother even said that it was news to her that he ever intended to go to the University of Arkansas. What he did at that time was skip over the legitimate alternatives to facing the draft and save himself for a crucial period of 3 or 4 months so that his chances of being drafted were minimal. In addition to that, and this is the real problem, it's the problem that follows on the problems he had in the Gennifer Flowers case, is it's become a character issue because he's changed what he says happened. For years, he said he did nothing to avoid the draft. Then he said he didn't remember what happened. Then he said it was because he was passionately opposed. He has not been forthright, and that is biting him.
Well, you're not being forthright if you're saying that, because he did not say that over the years. But leave that aside. What is wrong with somebody opposing the war in Vietnam, like a lot of other people do, seeking an alternative in ROTC, and then making himself available for the draft when you don't know, nobody knows, that this guy could have been drafted? He didn't get his draft number until 2 months after he put himself into the draft.
He claimed when this first broke that he didn't know what the situation was back then. He didn't know what the situation was back then, and the fact is that there's some real question of his credibility as to whether he ever intended to go into the ROTC. You know that, Bob, and he knows it, and so do the voters in New Hampshire, and that's the problem.
Senator McGovern, we're not going to refight the Vietnam War tonight. We had our arguments about that 20 years ago.
We all know it was a disaster now.
Senator, aren't you a little bit concerned about Governor Clinton's credibility, not on the question of whether he was wrong or right to be against the war as a young man, but the way he represents himself now, 2 decades later?
Well, first, let me say a couple of things about this. Governor Clinton isn't even accused of doing anything illegal. Everything he did was perfectly legal. Nobody even questions that. True. Secondly, this whole struggle that Bill Clinton fought out took place between the time he was about 18 and 22. We're not talking about a candidate for the president. We're talking about a teenager struggling with a war that was so complicated and I think so disastrous that looking back on it, I could forgive almost anything that a person did that was legal that kept them out of that war. And when I read that letter today that Bill Clinton wrote to the colonel in Arkansas, bearing his soul on this whole situation, I thought to myself, if my son had been able to write a letter like that at the age of 22, I'd have put it in a scrapbook. It was a brilliant, thoughtful, philosophical, probing document that indicates the quality of this man's mind, even at the age of 22.
Senator, there's a couple of things you said I'm going to pick up on later, but I want to get to the main point, and that is there's no question, as I read the letter, as I look at what he was doing, that Bill Clinton, and he wasn't a teenager, he was 23 years old.
At the end of the controversy, but he's been struggling with this thing. I know Bill Clinton well. He worked for me for a couple of years.
But to let me finish my question, there's no question that he, like millions of other young Americans, particularly well-educated young Americans, was trying his hardest to stay out of this war. Was he not?
No doubt about it.
There's no doubt about that.
I don't think he would deny that. And he said that in his letter.
Now,
what the hell is wrong with that?
Just a minute. And when the Wall Street Journal broke this story a week ago today, I happened to be standing this close to Bill Clinton when the press first asked him about it in the hotel lobby in Nashua, New Hampshire. And he said at that time that the reason he had taken himself out of the ROTC and put himself into the draft was because some of his friends were dying in the war, were sent to the war, and he didn't feel right about that. The letter that now comes out a week later takes no mention of that. Wasn't he being disingenuous? Wasn't he trying to make this an act not of expediency but of courage?
I think, Bob, that both facts were there. I think he was bothered about the fact that people his age were dying in Vietnam. I remember him talking about that to me.
But he didn't say that.
I recognize that.
Wait 1 second. The facts are documented. Wait a minute. The facts are documented. He lost friends in the war. Before you continue this right-wing conspiracy to bury the one guy that could beat this wimp George Bush. Wait a minute. Wait 1 second here. I want you to answer a question for me. All right. Listen. You say that he decided to do this because he didn't have friends die. That is not true. His friends died in that war. And so did some of mine.
If I could ask a question to Senator McGovern, the fact that the letter that you think, and it was an eloquent letter, makes no mention. Now he is talking to a colonel that he feels guilty, that he has misled him into thinking he was really serious about the ROTC. He makes no mention of boys dying, of friends dying. That comes out 20 years later. Doesn't that bother you a little bit?
What it tells me is that any one of us, looking back on something we did 20 years ago, may have a different interpretation of it now. I think that you have to recognize that Bill Clinton's now the governor of one of the states. He comes from a conservative state. Don't you think it's natural that he's going to try to play down...
Doesn't that hurt his credibility?
If it hurts his credibility, it's so minor compared to the fundamental problems that he has to deal with.
People like Novak. Go ahead.
No, going to what you said, the real problem that Bill Clinton faces as a result of all this is not what motivated him then and not what he did then, but how he's handled it today and the various stories he's put out over a period of time. The same thing happened in the Gennifer Flowers case, where he would not be forthright, he would not handle it directly, and voters pick up on that, Bob. You know it.
I understand. Listen, I understand he's in serious trouble. We'll talk about that in a minute. But you say his different versions of it. Bob Novak wrote a column which he said that Bill Clinton said that for 2 months he was in ROTC. They vehemently deny they ever said that today. Now, I don't believe Bob heard that wrong. Bob's an honest reporter.
I heard him.
But the fact of the matter is the press has reported this story 5 different ways with very little facts. And when Bob raises this point about this guy losing his friends, the facts are he did, and he talked about it a number of times over 20 years.
We all lost friends in that war. That is not the point. That's not the point Bob was making.
That's the point Bob just made.
No, it is not.
The point I'm making is that at the time that he is explaining to the colonel why he is reneging on this commitment to ROTC, which is a reneging coming after the time that the draft calls have disappeared and he's not going to be drafted. When he is reneging on that call, Governor Clinton does not in this letter raise the fact that he wants to fight with his friends in Vietnam.
In a sense, Bob, let me just say, in a sense, that's almost to his credit that he didn't try to make an emotional issue out of it with the colonel. He felt that he had a personal understanding with that colonel that he would join the ROTC rather than face the draft, and he was simply speaking to that issue in the letter. I thought he handled it very well. Could I make another point?
George, we'll make a point when we come back, and I want to make the point reneging is Novak's word. When we come back, can Bill Clinton make his comeback in New Hampshire?
Crossfire is brought to you by GE. From plastics to financial services, we bring good things to life.
Imagine your refrigerator with bigger door shelves for bigger bottles, with leftovers left in quick-serve trays for leftover space. More space, nearly 27 cubic feet, and a door in the door for things you use more. Imagine GE's Space Center 27.
Listen to the trees. They're trying to tell us something about what our polluted air is doing to them and to us. Fortunately, there's an answer. Natural gas. The cleanest burning fossil fuel we have. It can help save the air and everything that lives in it. Listen to the trees, because air pollution is a problem hanging over all of us. Use natural gas and we'll all breathe easier.
If all dogs were just puppies, all we'd make is puppy chow with extra protein and iron. Because puppies need up to twice the nutrition of adult dogs. But dogs are different. That's why we make Puppy Chow Dog Chow Fit and Trim and Purina High Pro. Vet tested, veterinarian recommended.
Tonight, how a brave cabbie sparked a debate. Hero or vigilante? Plus basketball greats Dr. J and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Tonight on Larry King Live, 9 Eastern on CNN. Welcome back. We're talking about Bill Clinton, the military draft questions, and now the even bigger questions about his political life. Our guest, former Senator George McGovern, the Democrats' nominee for president in 1972, whose campaign foundation was built on ending the war in Vietnam. Bill Clinton worked on Senator McGovern's campaign in Texas. And longtime Republican strategist David Keene, who is the chairman of the American Conservative Union. He's worked both for and against George Bush in other Republican presidential primaries. David, let's go back and talk about, take Bill Clinton out of this for a moment. Do you think it's possible in America, and you know presidential politics well, that somebody who actively opposed the war in Vietnam, somebody who actively tried not to participate in that war, could get elected president of the United States?
I think it's possible. I think that the strong feelings about the war are past us, but I think that how someone opposed the war and how that person tried to get out of serving in that war makes a big difference.
And you're saying that you're charging, and I assume Bob Novak is charging, that Bill Clinton has lied about the sequence of events and his participation and all that.
If he hasn't lied, he's dissembled. And that's the problem, and that's what's perceived by the voters. And you know, Bob, you referred to something that he's done on this and on something else before, and that is that he's attempted to build sympathy among Democratic primary voters by, on the one hand, sliding away from the issue, and on the other hand, saying all of his troubles are traceable to Republican attack machines, right-wing extremists, and all of that. Yeah. It won't wash because that's not where his troubles come from.
It may be where the truth is, however.
Can I pick up on this phrase, sliding away from the issues? That's the real tragedy of this whole thing. It doesn't make any difference at all to the future of the United States and to the well-being of our people, the outcome of these issues that Bill Clinton is being nailed on. The question of what he did as a 22-year-old in terms of the war in Vietnam, we know he opposed that war. Well, just a minute, Bob, and that shows good judgment on his part that he opposed it. Whether he took the proper course, we can debate. The fact is he did nothing illegal. He didn't believe in the war. And he's now released a letter that tells the whole story. It certainly satisfies me. The whole problem with this Gennifer Flowers, those are issues that really have no relevance.
But the decision, as you well know, the decision people make when they're selecting a president goes beyond individual issues. It goes to questions of character and judgment and background. It's a very complicated decision.
But character is measured by a lot of things other than these superficial...
well, not by them alone, no, Senator.
Right. But, obviously, Senator, it makes some difference to the people of New Hampshire, because if the polls are any indication...
We don't know that. We'll see what happens on Tuesday.
Right. Now, the question I want to ask you, Senator, is the letter that... I thought it was a moving letter, too, in many ways. But he said that... in that letter, he said that he wanted to maintain my political viability within the system by finding an alternative between resistance and serving in the draft. And he found the Air Force ROTC. In other words, at this age of 23, he was already running for something, maybe for president. Isn't that a little bit calculating?
I think it's calculating and remarkable. I like young men that look ahead and think about the possibilities that someday they might want to serve in public life. What's wrong with that?
Senator, you mentioned how young he was. You know, when I was his age, I was an officer in the United States Army.
I was too.
And you were too, and you had a great war record. So and you were responsible, and I was responsible.
I was in the good war that made some sense. There wasn't anything about Vietnam that made any sense to anybody.
I think Bob Kerrey, when he was fighting and winning the Congressional Medal of Honor, thought it was a good war.
John Kerry came back thinking the war was a mistake, and I think Bob Kerry does too.
And I think he does too, and I think most people do have any sense after looking at the carnage that's been displayed over there. But anyway, David, Bob just raised this, and I was waiting for him to come up with this cheap shot about political viability. Bill Clinton said something I thought made an enormous amount of sense. At that time, in that moment, to be against that war like I was to be ostracized from the political system. If you wanted to be a politician, there's nothing wrong with wanting to be a politician when you're 23 years old. He was right to try to protect his political viability because at that point, the right-wing Yahoo kooks in this country... Wait, here's my question is that we were being accused of being commies and all this stuff because we were against the war. Of course you've got to protect your political viability against right-wing nuts.
Is that the question?
Yeah. No, I want David's answer. I want David's answer.
I didn't know it was a question.
I listened to your speech for 5 minutes.
And there are politicians. And the politicians that I at least admire, and I think the ones that you admire, are the ones that confront issues head on and say where they stand. What he was saying then and what he's done now indicates that he's not that kind of a politician. He's more interested in viability than in communicating his beliefs to the public.
I hope you don't think he invented that approach to politics.
I sure don't.
The thing that bothers me, and I am an admirer of Bill Clinton. I thought he still is the most impressive campaigner of all the announced Democratic candidates. But the thing that bothers me is that you check on these dates, and he said that he was not aware that Richard Nixon on September 19th had announced no more draft calls for the rest of the year. In other words, when he threw himself into the drafts, there was no risk. Is that credible that a young man who is spending so much time in anguish, he said he couldn't sleep, he couldn't eat, thinking about whether he was going to be in the draft, did not know that suddenly there was an event by the president that created celebration on college campuses all over America?
I can tell you that everybody of that age at that time knew exactly what the situation was.
I know you think I'm stupid, but
I don't know what he knew about that. Obviously, how do any of us know whether he knew the situation at that time, other than to say this: if the draft is so sacred, it's strange that Richard Nixon decided to lift it at that point. Well, I think the draft always has been a kind of an arbitrary thing. There are a great many patriotic Americans who think the best way to get soldiers is by the volunteer system.
Don't you?
And I don't think the draft is all that sacred.
Don't you think it is remarkable too that the letter to the colonel came immediately after the fact that he got a very high draft number?
Are you a prosecuting attorney on this case, Bob? Are you a prosecuting attorney?
I don't think there's any doubt that I don't think there's any doubt that Bill Clinton was trying to avoid being taken to Vietnam. It was a war he didn't believe in. He didn't think it served any useful interest for him, for the country, or anybody else. I'd like to repeat what I said at the beginning. He did nothing illegal. As far as I'm concerned, if you were as opposed to that war as Bill Clinton and George McGovern were, anything you could do legally, anything you could do legally to avoid it, you should do.
Okay, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to try to find if there was a way or is a way that Bill Clinton could save himself. Senator George McGovern, a week ago today, Bill Clinton was leading the field. Everybody thought he was going to be nominated, a good chance to beat George Bush. When this thing broke, if he had just said, yes, I hated this war, I did everything I could to stay out, and I'm proud of it, would he have been better off?
Probably would have. I think that's a political tactic, but I think he'd have probably been better off to play it that way.
Can he do anything now?
Let me say this to you, Bob. Bill Clinton did stand up against that war when it counted, which was when the war was on. It's easy to look back on it 20 years later and see the mistakes that we made. I see some mistakes I made 20 years ago or 40 years ago. A lot of serious mistakes.
Is there anything he can do now?
Well, I think what he can do is to try to get this campaign back on the issues that people are concerned about. He can't do anything about his draft record 20 years ago. He can't do anything about Gennifer Flowers, but he can talk to us about the condition of the American economy and what he would do about it as president. He can talk about our educational crisis, the environmental problems, the difficulties that many of our people have. And I think the real tragedy of this whole thing over the last 3 weeks is that it's throwing the whole country off the track in terms of what we ought to be talking about.
But George, it has, David, I ask you two fast political questions. One, do you think Bill Clinton has a chance to survive, say, by surviving coming to number 2? And secondly, does this now bring Dan Quayle and his avoiding the draft right back to the forefront and hurt George Bush?
In the first instance, whether he finishes number 2 in New Hampshire or not is not relevant to the question of whether he's going to survive, because he can't survive. Secondly, yes, there'll be more discussion of Dan Quayle and what he did during the Vietnam War. But the fact is, though, that he took one of the legitimate alternatives that were available to him, and it's a different kind of situation. In a sense, it is tragic because Bill Clinton is a bright guy, he's articulate, and he has been trying to pull the Democratic Party, the party that you helped drag off into unreasonableness, back toward reasonableness, but he, from a political standpoint, is dead.
Okay, we're out of time. Thank you very much, David Keene, Senator George McGovern. Bob Beckel and I will be back to fight our own war in a minute. Said that I'm part of some kind of Republican conspiracy to do in Bill Clinton. It was only a couple weeks ago that the Bush people were saying I was part of the Clinton cabal because I was defending him on the sex question of Gennifer Flowers. He was being unfairly beaten on that, but he has made a mistake, not in his position on the war, but the way he's handled the war.
I just wish you would have been as fair and as good on this issue of conscience and dedication to a guy's beliefs as you were when the Gennifer Flowers thing. You were good on that. You have not been good on this one. From the left, I'm Bob Beckel. Good night for Crossfire.
From the right, I'm Robert Novak. Join us again next time for another edition of Crossfire.
We go first tonight to the political legacy of the Vietnam War. That legacy haunts the generation of political candidates now in their mid-40s, men who were of draft age in the Vietnam era. In particular, it surfaced in the New Hampshire presidential primary. Yesterday, Democratic presidential candidate Bill Clinton released a letter which he'd written in 1969 to the director of the Reserve Officers Training Corps at the University of Arkansas. The letter explains why he decided to give up the deferment he'd received and make himself available to the draft. We'll hear the views of 4 men, 2 who served and 2 who didn't, but first some excerpts from the Clinton letter to Colonel Eugene Holmes of the Arkansas ROTC program. First, I want to thank you not just for saving me from the draft, but for being so kind and decent to me last summer when I was as low as I've ever been. I came to believe that the draft system itself is illegitimate. No government really rooted in limited parliamentary democracy should have the power to make its citizens fight and kill and die in a war they may oppose, a war which even possibly may be wrong, a war which in any case does not involve immediately the peace and freedom of the nation. Because of my opposition to the draft and the war, I am in great sympathy with those who are not willing to fight, kill, and maybe die for their country. That is, the particular policy of a particular government. The decision not to be a resistor and the related subsequent decisions were the most difficult of my life. I decided to accept the draft in spite of my beliefs for one reason, to maintain my political viability within the system. For years, I've worked to prepare myself for a political life characterized by both practical political ability and concern for rapid social progress. It is a life I still feel compelled to lead. When the draft came, despite political convictions, I was having a hard time facing the prospect of fighting a war I had been fighting against, and that is why I contacted you. ROTC was the one way left in which I could possibly, but not positively, avoid both Vietnam and resistance. After I signed the ROTC letter of intent, I began to wonder whether the compromise I had made with myself was not more objectionable than the draft would have been, because I had no interest in the ROTC program in itself, and all I seemed to have done was to protect myself from physical harm. I am writing in the hope that my telling this one story will help you to understand more clearly how so many fine people have come to find themselves still loving their country, but loathing the military, to which you and other good men have devoted years, lifetimes of the best service you could give. To many of us, it is no longer clear what is service and what is disservice, or if it is clear, the conclusion is likely to be illegal. Now, 4 perspectives on the Vietnam factor in today's politics. James Webb is an author and former Secretary of the Navy during the Reagan administration. He was a highly decorated Marine Corps officer in Vietnam. James Fellows is the Washington editor of The Atlantic magazine. He received a student as well as a medical draft deferment. Michael Mendelbaum is a professor of American foreign policy at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. He also had a medical draft deferment. Republican Senator John McCain of Arizona was a naval aviator. His plane was shot down in 1967, and he spent 5.5 years as a prisoner of war. He joins us from studios at public station KAET in Tempe, Arizona. James Webb, what does Bill Clinton's letter about his Vietnam ambivalence say about his fitness to be president and commander-in-chief?
I thought it was an interesting letter in 2 respects. The first is it was very British in the first part of it. I mean, in terms of the parliamentary democracy and the citizen's obligation. And Britain is one of the few countries that has rarely relied on a draft. It's a very heavily a volunteer system and was even through most of World War I. But that disturbs me also because I fear as a nation that we are moving more toward the British idea of accepting class, rigid class structures in our governmental system and in our social life. And it's sort of ironic to me that Governor Clinton spent a good bit of the Vietnam War in Britain, as did Jim Fallows, by the way, and that this idea that we can have an elite that doesn't have the same sorts of obligations, that has a different educational system, that has a different way to insulate itself from criminal problems and this sort of thing, disturbs me. The second part of the letter, which was specifically relating to the impact of the war on the individuals, I have some empathy with. I don't agree with it. The premise, I think, from so many of the people of the elite in our generation who did not go into the military was that this was an odious, genocidal, immoral, wrong war. And I don't agree with that.
Does the letter say, and the anguish behind it, say anything about his fitness to be the commander-in-chief or the president?
I wouldn't be the one to pass judgment on that. I would rather let the voters pass judgment on that. I think it's appropriate for the letter to be out and let people struggle with that themselves.
Michael Mendelbaum, you wrote in the New York Times rather defensively about Bill Clinton. What do you think this says about his fitness to be president?
Well, let me say first, Robin, that I don't feel defensive about Bill Clinton. He's an old, although not a close friend.
Supportively, I should have said.
He is the most talented and gifted public servant I know, and I think that he'd be a wonderful president. But let me say 2 things about that letter, because I think it does tell us 2 things that are important in judging him as a presidential candidate. First, that letter demonstrates conclusively that Bill Clinton has told the truth about his Vietnam experience, contrary to some press accounts. He has said, and that letter bears out, as did some research I did, that what he did was to give up a deferment in an ROTC program that would have kept him out of Vietnam, put himself back into the draft pool, make himself vulnerable to the draft, with the expectation that he would be drafted for reasons of conscience. The second thing I think that this letter demonstrates is the moral anguish of a young man, and there were many of us in that position, who is in an impossible position, torn between his hatred of the war and his love for his country, between his dedication to his principles and his dedication to his community. There was no single right choice. There was no way to be easy about what one did. The word compromise was in the excerpt that you read, and that is the operative word. One could only compromise one's principles. I would also point out that what Bill Clinton ultimately decided to do speaks directly to the very important point that Secretary Webb made. He decided that he could not, in good conscience, accept an ROTC commission and avoid the draft as many of his high school classmates had not been able to do, because it wasn't fair for him to have an opportunity and a privilege and an exit from the war that they did not have. So his decision was based precisely on the very important point that Secretary Webb raised and that Mr. Fallows has written eloquently about.
Okay. Senator McCain, what's your view of the relevance of Mr. Clinton's, Governor Clinton's behavior during the Vietnam era to his fitness to be president?
I have to say to you that I don't think it's very relevant. I think it's a situation of anguish, of difficulty, of discord within our nation, which was very upsetting to all young Americans, no matter which decision they made. I think Governor Clinton should be judged on his record as governor, as Attorney General, on his proposals for America in the future, and I think that a letter such as he wrote displayed to a large degree what many young Americans were going through at that time. It's hard for us to recapture the incredible emotional instability that existed in this nation at that time.
What do you feel about it, James?
Well, I'd like to go back to the point Jim Webb was making, also that Michael Manenbaum touched on. This precise point of class differences in America is one that I think many of us here on this panel share, although we might disagree about other things. And it was because Bill Clinton was taking that seriously. He was saying, it is not fair for me to isolate myself in the long run in a British-type system. And that, I think, is to his credit. The other thing that struck me in
Can I just get James Webb to come in on that, since that was your point? Is that to his credit that he was doing?
I don't pretend to be an expert on Bill Clinton's motives, and I've read a lot of different things about the timing of the letter and when he decided to recuse himself from this sort of consideration. So it wouldn't be fair for me to say whether that was an honest comment or not. I'm glad that all of this is out on the table and other people can judge.
Mm-hmm. Well, even on his own terms, he was dealing directly at this issue at a time when many people didn't, when many people wanted to avert their eyes from the class effects of the war. So that is to his credit. The other thing, the impact this letter had on me, hearing it last night at 11:30, was to bring back what that world was like. If you were for the war, as I was not, I assume it was a more straightforward decision. If you were for it, then you thought other people should fight, and you should too. If you were against the war, as Governor Clinton was and I was, it was a more complicated thing because you balanced, you didn't think anybody should go, but how you sort of squared your own sense of honor about what you did. And I think the letter showed him wrestling seriously with that issue.
Mm-hmm. I would like to come in on that.
Yeah, do.
Because I think that, first of all, in the letter itself, he mentioned his political aspirations, and if it is true that he knew at that time that there wasn't going to be another draft call, then it doesn't show that. And again, I leave that to other people. But the real problem here is with people struggling that we've never given the people who went forward and went into the military the credit for their struggles too. I have a very close friend who's in a wheelchair right now because he enlisted out of conscience because he struggled with these same issues. And the fact is that
there are many who are dead.
Yes, we all struggled with different elements of that, and there are consequences that people need to be addressing.
Well, beyond the consequences in the individual conscience, should they have immediate consequences in presidential choices this year or the next time around, or as long as the Vietnam generation are candidates for office? Let me introduce the name of Dan Quayle into this as well, because the voters appear to have decided in 1988, at any rate, that Dan Quayle's behavior in the war did not disqualify him for the highest office. So let's include him in the equation as we go around.
I would agree with the general sentiment that you don't want to drag. This was such a difficult time in American history for people on every side that it doesn't want to be an anchor on our life for the rest of our lives. I would, however...
It doesn't want to be, but...
Well, it should not be. We would not want it to be. I would nonetheless suggest this distinction between Governor Clinton's situation and that of Vice President Quayle. Quayle's position was that the war was a good idea and somebody should do it, but not him. Clinton's position was that nobody should do it. There seems to me a difference between those points of view.
Do you see that, Senator? I saw you smiling when I mentioned Quayle.
Well, first of all, I don't agree that Vice President Quayle emerged unscathed. In fact, I think his very low popularity ratings can be attributed to a large degree over the enormous publicity surrounding his service in the Guard. And I certainly take strong exception to the last comment that because he joined the Guard, he therefore knew that he would not have to go. Just some year ago, lots of Guard people went and fought, and many of them died. So I reject that categorically. Also, could I say that, you know, it's interesting that with all of the media attention on this, we lose the attention on the issues that are very important to the future of the American people. And I wonder sometimes, and I'm not trying to bash the media, I know that's non-productive, that if they aren't inflating this issue to a degree which obscures the race, and I want to point out finally that we've been through a difficult healing process in this country, culminating with Operation Desert Storm, and I'm not sure that it helps to go back into this debate again, no matter who the candidate is, particularly one who has a long record of public service as Governor Clinton does.
How do you feel about that, Michael Mandelbaum? Is this a unprofitable diversion from the real stuff of the campaign, or what?
Robin, let me make a couple of points. First, in response to some very important points that Secretary Webb made, he raised the question, which has been raised in the media, of whether Governor Clinton put himself back in the draft when he knew he would not be called. All the evidence we have and the recollections of people who were with him every day is that that is not true. He did expect to be called. He was not finessing the draft. He fully expected to be drafted. The second point that Secretary Webb made, I think, is a very important one about people who did serve. Vietnam veterans have been very badly treated in this country over the last 20 years, and I think there's a curious symmetry between the shabby treatment of Bill Clinton, and I think it has been shabby, and the shabby treatment of people who served. We just don't want to come to terms with that war. It was an unhappy, unpleasant experience, and anybody who had anything to do with it is tarred with that brush.
Shabby treatment of Clinton by whom?
Well, that goes to the point that Senator McCain made. There's been enormous focus on this issue at the expense of the important issues. And not only that, but there has been criticism, there has been attack, there's been even slander on Governor Clinton for things that he didn't do. And on this issue, he demonstrably didn't do it. He did not dodge the draft. He acted as honorably and decently and straightforwardly as he knew how, and that action resulted in him making himself subject to the draft despite the fact that he opposed the war.
You want to come back on that?
Again, I'm not too good on the exact chain of events on this, and as a result, that's why I'm not really commenting. I think it should be in front of the voters. But, you know, there is something here, that this argument that we're having about who went and who didn't and how they did that, it is an important argument for voters to look at. There is a question of moral authority. First, because it's a question of moral authority. And that is, again, it's for the voters to look at. Does Governor Clinton, based on having come of age and taken a specific set of actions during a war, have the moral authority to order other people to die? I don't think it's essential for someone to have been a veteran to be president. We've had some very fine presidents who were not. We've got a Secretary of Defense right now who is not a veteran.
Why would it be a question whether he had the moral authority or not?
I think because of the questions that have been raised in terms of going into the ROTC unit and the timing of the draft and these sorts of things. And again, I don't pretend to be an expert on
more or less than Vice President Quayle in this seminar.
I agree with Senator McCain on the point that I don't think that Vice President Quayle's situation was affirmed by a vote for George Bush 4 years ago. I think I would leave Vice President Quayle's situation to the voters too.
Does it bring into question Governor Clinton's moral authority to order troops into action if he became president?
If he deals with this honestly, I think not. I think this letter is a step towards a kind of honesty that could, in principle, be a cleansing for the nation and perhaps for the governor too. I say perhaps because he may end up being a victim of this and may be a casualty. What I have in mind here is there are certain kinds of truths that are acceptable and not acceptable in political discourse. It's now acceptable for people to say, well, I was interested in other women or men, and I still want to be a candidate. The question with Governor Clinton is whether it's acceptable to recall how divisive the mood was 25 years ago. I have great respect for what Senator McCain was saying about reconciliation and healing. I disagree with him factually in what he said about the National Guard. Anybody who was in college in the late 60s knows exactly why one joined the National Guard then. There was no mystery about that at all. It's different now, but then...
But he's right. Lots of National Guard units did go to Vietnam, and many people from them were lost.
That is true.
Few did. No, few did. And I was the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Reserve Affairs, and I ran the numbers on it. So, I mean, people knew when they were going into the Guard.
I happen to know of a couple of units that went where significant numbers.
In '68, a small number were called up by President Johnson, but it was the only time. There's a larger question here, though, and that is that when as a class, the elite of our age group did not go, many things happened. And Jim wrote about the danger of class warfare, and it is there in this country in a lot of ways. But also, think of the battlefield itself. I mean, this is an accountability that people who didn't go have to think about. For every William Clinton who does not go into the military, the Army has to find a William Calley. And when Harvard excludes itself, they lost 12 people in the military in the entire Vietnam War out of 13,000 people who graduated from '62 to '72, then it affects not only what they do for the rest of their lives, but it affects battlefield performance.
Let me ask the Senator again. Senator McCain, what do you think about the question of Clinton or anybody else's moral authority to order troops into action with a background like this?
I think it's clear he would have entire moral authority, whatever is necessary, because, as I say, I think the issue is almost irrelevant. He has a long record of public service. We can judge him on that. And I think that to allege behavior of some person at 18, 19, or 20 years old would therefore affect their ability to conduct their duties as president is really not particularly accurate. And I would also like to make one other point, and that is, in case the professor missed it, there was a great healing process that took place, and I think it might have been the most beneficial outcome of the Persian Gulf War. And this reconciliation and this healing towards the Vietnam veteran was a tremendous manifestation, and what we're doing now may be reopening some of those wounds that were so painfully healed.
Well, let me move it on to another person in this current presidential race, and that is Bob Kerrey. You mentioned irrelevant. Many people expected Kerry's heroism in Vietnam to make him an extremely viable candidate. And so far, at least according to the polls in New Hampshire, he doesn't seem to have caught fire the way some others have. Mark Shields, who comments on politics on this program, suggests that his very heroism and his Medal of Honor make many potential voters uncomfortable.
I would personally disagree. I am a Democrat, although I'm not involved in politics. And I think many Democrats were excited about the prospect of a Kerry candidacy because it was a chance to unify around a hero, somebody who had proven this kind of heroism. The execution of his campaign has not been that great so far, but the idea of him as a candidate, I think, was energizing to many Democrats.
What do you think about that? I mean, the way Kerry's extraordinary performance in Vietnam has been almost irrelevant.
Well, again, I would say two things, just very, very quickly. One is that I think the most important thing about who served and who didn't, and I've been saying this for years, is to grant validity to the people who went and not to try to tear apart the people who didn't. Right. The second thing is that Jim Fallows wrote years ago that perhaps someday this would be viewed as in the same sense as Trotsky versus Stalin, something that gets us going, but that other people view as sort of passé, and perhaps you see that in this sort of issue up there.
Mm-hmm. What do you think of the Kerry factor, Senator?
I think that my experience has been that the people that you are seeking to represent will show a great deal of gratitude for your past service, but I think that they are far more interested in what you are going to do for them in the future. And if, as not a close observer of the New Hampshire campaign, I think perhaps Senator Kerry's problem is he hasn't been able to focus enough on the issues that resonate with the people of New Hampshire who are in very bad conditions at this particular time. But I don't think anyone would do anything but praise his war record, which is clearly exemplary, but I don't think it would make anyone uncomfortable.
Michael Mandelbaum, to pick up on the Senator's earlier point, do you think the Gulf War and the rapturous reception of those troops and the better reception which rubbed off on the Vietnam veterans have helped to dilute this as an issue, and that we're really talking about something that is not a deep emotional core in the voters anymore?
It certainly helped. And I would like to feel that that is right. I would like to feel that Senator McCain is correct, that the Gulf War has helped us heal that wound. But I recall Senator Kerry saying at one point that he thought his Vietnam service and his heroism was not an asset in New Hampshire, that it made people uncomfortable. I don't know whether we put this behind us, and I think the way we as a nation and we as an electorate treat Bill Clinton. Whether we're able to get beyond all this and deal with the issues will be a test of that.
Do you think the Gulf War and so on has diluted this issue?
Absolutely not. And I disagree with Senator McCain. I don't think the Gulf War provided the Vietnam veteran with any sort of accolades. And in fact, it was the other way around. All the press buildup to the Gulf War was comparing this volunteer military with the rags and tags that existed at the end of the Vietnam War. It was a negative for the people who served in Vietnam.
May I say that,
Senator?
I interrupt? Yes.
Yeah.
Then Jim Webb was not present at numerous parades that I either attended or observed, at celebrations on the Mall where the mention of the service of our Vietnam veterans evoked the most emotion and the most applause and the most warmth and love on the part of the American people than I've ever seen displayed. Clearly, Jim, you were not there.
Jim?
I wasn't where you are, but I'm around a lot of Vietnam veterans, and I feel pretty comfortable with what I do. And I read a lot of stuff, a lot of the analyses.
I'm sorry you weren't there.
Yeah, well,
I think the crucial word here is service. For many years after Vietnam, there were these polarized, stereotyped views of Vietnam veterans among non-veterans. Either they were dangerous, they were to be pitied, whatever. The last 5 or 6 years, and especially after the Gulf War, I agree with the senator here, there has been this emphasis that Vietnam veterans served. They served the nation. They served duty, and that seems to be a much more widespread feeling than 10 or 15 years ago.
Yeah. With whom? You seem to feel it more strongly than the others. With what kind of voter? Could you mention a profile of American for whom you think this is still a big issue and who would look at somebody who didn't serve and didn't have a very good reason for not serving with some negative eye? What kind of American?
Just to get back to John McCain real quickly, I would be interested to look at some polls on whether this has changed the way people look at Vietnam veterans.
I'd be more than happy to show them to you.
Okay, well, I'd like to see them because I would disagree with you on that. I think the best way to put this behind us is for all of us who spent so much energy on the Vietnam War to try to get the right political conditions inside Vietnam. We've got 67 million people over there who have been put under a Stalinist system. 1 million of the best young leaders in Vietnam have been marched off. Some of them are still in re-education camps, and we can't get anybody to focus on it because people are still embarrassed about the war. And in terms of who this particular issue will resonate with, I think, we're sitting up here in the newsroom and on the Senate floor and whatever. Go into the factory floor and talk to the people who are the supervisors there and see how they react.
Michael Mandelbaum?
Robin, James Fallows made a very important point. He used the word service. I think those of us who felt conflicted and anguished in the Vietnam era and did not serve have thought ever since about what our obligation to our country is and what kind of service we can render and how we can justify our actions. James Fallows has written a very important article on the subject. I myself became a professional student of foreign policy, and I've thought about that war constantly. And I have the impression that one effect that it had on Bill Clinton was to push him more deeply into public service as a way of demonstrating to himself and to his community that although he did not feel able conscientiously to volunteer for service in Vietnam, although he did make himself available for the draft, there were ways, constructive ways, that he could serve the country, just as Senator McCain and Secretary Webb have served it in that way as well.
Sorry to cut you off, but we have used up our time this evening. Gentlemen, thank you all.
This week was the Clinton letter and the question of whether there has been additional damage to the Arkansas governor's candidacy. And Steve, one of the things that this letter certainly brought forth was a revival of some of those old moral issues pertaining to Vietnam.
Well, it certainly did, Paul. A year ago, we were sitting around this table and saying that perhaps the Persian Gulf War had finally buried the ghost of Vietnam in this country. But now we know that judgment was premature, and this whole controversy surrounding the Clinton letter certainly recalls for us how difficult those moral choices were that so many of us made. And the reason why it's coming back is because this Vietnam generation is now on the brink of leadership. George Bush almost certainly be the last World War II veteran to be president of this country. And so now the Vietnam generation is poised to take over. And on one level,
the question is, what did you do in the war, Daddy? Was it more moral to fight, or was it more moral to find a way out? Was it more moral to serve your country or serve your conscience? And we have not resolved those questions in this country. And it's interesting that the 5 Democrats, each one represents a different version of the choices that many thousands of Americans made. Bob Kerrey went to war, came home a war hero. Tom Harkin went into the military largely to finance his education. Not any great surge of patriotism. Spent 5 years in the military. Paul Tsongas went in the Peace Corps. Jerry Brown went into a Catholic seminary. And Bill Clinton was probably the most typical of all, using educational deferments, as many of us did, including me, to get out as much as you could, and finally liberated by a high draft number. But there's another level here that this is important, because it's not just what did you do in the war, it's how do you explain what you did in the war. Because in some ways, the issue of Vietnam has become a metaphor for this question that I think is at the core of what a lot of voters want this year, which is someone they can trust.
Steve,
and so how they handle it becomes as important as what they did.
Steve, you know, Bob Kerrey told me the other week that he finds sometimes out on the campaign trail, he has to explain to Democratic primary voters why he even enlisted. Here he is, a war hero, having defended his even enlisting. But I wonder if it's as complicated as you portray it, because I think the question with Clinton is whether he's telling the straight story about what happened.
You come back to credibility.
It comes back to credibility. There are questions about whether he actually ever had the RO, what he has said about whether he had the deferment, about who interceded or did not intercede. You've sifted through all the evidence. What's your sense on the solidity of his story?
I think it has some holes. I think that the most damaging part of that letter was where he said, I didn't resist because I was worried about my future political viability. He didn't, you know, he did not say that originally. He said, I went into the draft because I was worried about my friends who've been killed. And what that letter reveals is a very calculating young man who had always sought a career in politics. And that's probably not the best image to have in a year when there's such an anti-incumbent feeling.
But the letter also reflects, as Howard indicated just a moment ago, the anguish of a 23-year-old man. And there were so many young people during that period who went through the same thing that Bill Clinton did. And the Clinton people are all saying they're getting a bum rap from the press on this.
As a matter of fact, the numbers, you know, Clinton had a precipitous fall in the numbers over the last couple of days, but it kind of leveled out for 2 reasons, I think. A lot of people did read the letter, and by the way, the Clinton campaign printed the full text of the letter in the Manchester Union Leader. There's a lot of sympathy for what you're saying, Paul, and also there is a press part of this equation. The Clinton campaign is going around saying, don't let the press take your vote away from you, focus on the economic issues, and that's helping Clinton right now.
But Howard, how much of that is not really the issue when it comes down to Clinton? I mean, this was an election where Democrats thought they had a chance to win, and they thought perhaps with Clinton getting the nomination, they could go forward. Now it seems like he's being nibbled by 1,000 ducks. Every time it's something else. Can he go very much further beyond New Hampshire?
Well, first of all, he's got a lot of money in the bank. He's got a lot of political support in the bank, so to speak. The Southerners are sticking with him, at least publicly for now, and elsewhere, in part because they're not sure where else they're going to go. They're going to go with Paul Tsongas. Paul Tsongas is a decent, tough guy, but will he sell in the South? I seriously doubt it. So they don't have anywhere else to go just yet. They're waiting for a few more duck nibbles, perhaps, to see what else is going to happen. But before Tuesday, they're not going to jump ship.